Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope you all are doing well. Today we're going to talk about DynamoDB database provided by Amazon. We're going to create a new table from scratch, and then we're going to learn how to connect to the table using Python's Boto3 library. And finally, we're going to see how you can perform the basic operations to get data, put new data, delete data, and update data. So the first step is going to be to go ahead and create a new table. So I'm in the DynamoDB page of AWS. Once in there, make sure you know which region you're in over here. So I'm in US East 1. Over here, currently I have one table called customer. So we're going to create a new table. So I hit create table, and then you give it a table name. In our case, we're going to call it customers. Let's just call it students. So we're going to have a table with all the details about every student. You need to give it a partition key. So the way in DynamoDB you identify rows is by a primary key, and your primary key has to be unique for every row. Now the question is, what is this primary key? So your primary key consists of one or more partition key and sort key. In our case, we're going to have a very simple table where the primary key is just a student ID. So we're going to call it student ID and give it a data type of number. We don't really need a sort key. I am going to have a future video where we go and talk about primary key, what's a partition key, what's a sort key, and all those sort of things. But the purpose of this video is to show you how you can do all the basic operations using Python on a DynamoDB table. So that being said, we're going to call our table students. It's going to have a partition key of student ID. We're going to keep all the other settings default and go ahead and hit create table. So this should create the table for us. So you see we have a table called students, and currently the status is creating. We need to give AWS a few minutes to create the table for us. While the table is being created, I'm going to go to the Python code and show you how you can connect to DynamoDB in the first place. So this is where our Python code is going to be. So the first thing you need is to import Boto3. This is the library that you use to talk to AWS for whatever service you need. If you don't have Boto3 installed, I would encourage you to do a pip3 install Boto3. That should make sure that Boto3 is installed in your computer. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and start from scratch. So the first thing you need to know is how can you connect to the DynamoDB client. So that's very simple. You do boto3.client and then you name the client. In our case, it's going to be DynamoDB. That's all you need to connect to the DynamoDB, so super straightforward. Let's go and check if our table has been created. So it says the students table was created successfully. So we know that the table has been created. So I'm going to go ahead and run you through how the table looks. So we're going to click on the table and then click explore table items. So this is your table. Your query did not return any results because currently we don't have any result. So let's go ahead and hit create item, which is going to create one item. So if you remember, we had our student ID as the primary key, or in this case, just the partition key. We're going to give it, let's say 1. And then we're going to add another column. So the columns are called attributes, right? So we're going to give it a string. We're going to call it name. We're going to give it a value. Let's give it Bob. We're going to add another column. So unlike a relational database, in a NoSQL database, you have the flexibility to add as many columns as you want. The only restriction here that you have is you want to make sure every row has a primary key. And in our case, we said our primary key is student ID. So now for every row, you can add as many columns as you need. You don't have to worry about like changing the schema every single time. So yeah, we added one column called name and the value is Bob. And then we're going to add a new, let's give it a number. And we're going to, let's say, have it as age. I'm going to give it like, let's say 22. Okay, so our table is going to consist of 3 columns, student ID, name, and age. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create item over here. And this is going to create the row for us. There you go. We have one row over here. Let's go ahead and add another. So you hit create item again. Student ID, let's put 2 now. If you remember, your first column was called name. Let's say Alice. And then you give it an age. If I know how to type, there you go. Let's give it 28 and then create item. So now we have 2 rows in our table, and now let's just work with these 2 rows. Okay. So the first thing we're gonna learn is how to get an item by its primary key. Okay. So we're gonna do response equals. All you have to do is do client.getItem, and then you give it the name of the table. In our case, the name of the table is students. So I'm gonna copy that. And then you have the key. This is gonna be your primary key. So in our case, it's just a student ID, right? So this is where you need to remember a bit of syntax. So you give it student, and before giving the value, so you can't just say, sorry, it should be student ID. So you can't just say student ID equals 100, right? You can't do that. The way you give it a value, so the key is student ID, and the value is going to be a dictionary, and the dictionary is going to be a key value pair. The key is going to be the data type, and the value is going to be the actual value in string. So our data type is for student ID. This is a number, right? So that's going to be n. I'm going to link you to the documentation where you can easily see which data type is which key. Number is n, string is going to be s, so they're pretty straightforward. So n, and then the value in our case is going to be, let's say we want 1. So 1. Okay. But one thing to remember is the value needs to be a string, right? So in the backend, DynamoDB is going to convert it to a number. But when you're sending the request across the network, you want it to be a string. So we're going to make it a string. Okay. So now we have the, let me just make it format better. So we have the table name, and then we have the key. Okay. And then, there you go. Oops, there you go. So we have the table name, and then we have the key. The next thing you want is which attributes do you want to get? Because we have age and name, right? So you can pass it something called attributes to get and give it a list. So we want our student ID, we want our age, and we want our name. So we want all 3. If you want a subset of the attributes or columns, you can just have like 1 or 2 of them. Yeah, so and then we're gonna print the response out. Okay, now let's run it. We're gonna do Python 3 dynamodb.py. And there you go. You see we get the item over here. So I'm gonna just to make it look better, I'm gonna print the item attribute only. This way it's gonna be more clear what we're getting. Okay, there you go. So in the response, we have the item, which is gonna be a dictionary, and the format you get the result is the same format that you are defining the key. So your key is gonna be the name of the column, and then the value is gonna be another key value pair, where the key is gonna be the data type, and the value is gonna be the actual value in string. So if you look at this one, so our student ID is a number. So you have student ID, and then a key value pair. And in the key value pair, your key is the data type. It's a number, so we have n. And the value is 1, but it's a string, because you know when DynamoDB is sending the data back to you, it sends a string. Similarly, when you are sending the data to DynamoDB, you pass it a string. So you can just cast it to an int easily. Same for name. You have the data type, it's a string, so you have s, and then the name Bob. For age, the same thing. You have the data type, which is n for number, and then the value, which is 22. In this case, it's a string, but you can easily cast it to an int. So that's how you get an item by the key. So just remember, you do have to define the primary key to get it. There are ways to do like a select star without a where clause in relational database. And over here, you can do that too. But to make the queries more performant, it's ideal that you always query when you know the primary key. Okay, so that's your get item. Now let's go ahead and delete item. Okay, so this is also going to be very simple. We are going to do client.delete item. You're going to give it a table name. In our case, it's going to be called students. And then you give it the key. So if you want to delete something, of course, you have to give it the primary key. Our primary key is going to be student ID. And then once again, same thing, you give it a key value pair. The key is going to be your data type, and the value is going to be the value as a string. Okay, so we are giving it this. So we are telling DynamoDB to delete the row where the student ID is set to 1. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out and then run that. So that ran successfully. Let's go to our database and do a refresh. And you see we don't have student ID 1 anymore. We just have 2. Okay, so very easy to delete an item. That being said, let's go to the next one now, where we are gonna be adding a new item. So before we were using the UI create item, but of course in an application, you're gonna be programmatically adding items to your database table. So once again, very simple. All you do is do client.put item. You give it the table name, which is gonna be students. You give it the item. So every row in DynamoDB is called the item. So the item is gonna be a dictionary. The first attribute is gonna be customer ID. Oh, sorry, that's the other table. So we need student ID. Let's say it's gonna be a key value pair again. Student ID is a number, so you do n, and then you pass it the ID. In our case, let's do 5. Okay, so that's your first attribute. The next one is gonna be name. Okay, key value. Oh my god, let me just get the okay, yeah, key value pair again. Your key is gonna be the data type. In our case, it's a string, so S, and then the name. Let's say Mike. Yeah. And lastly, the next column we have is age. So it's going to be a key value once again. It's going to be called age. The value is going to be a key value again. Where do I? Right. So you won't be there. Okay. So it's going to be age. Right. And then let me just cancel this. There you go. The value is gonna be a dictionary again, where the key is gonna be the data type, age is a number, so n, and then the value itself, let's do 32. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and now, so right now you have only one ID. And there you go, we have our new one, we're at student ID. Student ID 5, age 32, and Mike. If you want to do another, let's do like 10. Let's put the name as Trevor, and then let's put the age as like 41. Run it, refresh, and you get another. So you can see you can add as many rows as you want. Another cool thing is you can go ahead and add literally any column that you want to. So let's say we have another called gender, and we give it a string, and we say M for male, right? And now, oh, we already have Trevor, do we? Yeah, so we have to give it a unique ID. So let's give like 12, and let's give the name as Martin. Okay, and let's give the age as 35. So if we run it and then refresh, you can see we have a new column called gender. All of them are null except M. Now, if we try to, let me just do, comment out the put. Now let's try to get our student ID with ID 12 that has the gender. Okay. Let's see what happens. So you get everything over here. For attributes to get, you have to add the new attribute over here, which is gonna be gender. And you see we're getting the student ID, we're getting name, gender, and age. Now let's try to get the row of a student that does not have a gender defined over here. Okay, so student ID 2. So you see we have a student ID, name, and age. We do not have a key called gender because for this student, the gender is not defined in the table. Okay, so you can see it's very easy to add new columns on the fly, but when reading it, you have to be mindful about checking if the column is there or not for a given row. All right, so I'm gonna comment this out again. So we learned how to do a get, we learned how to do a delete, we also learned how to put items, to do a insert pretty much. The last thing we have is how can you update a row. Okay, so we're gonna update the student ID to the row over here. Okay, so once again, I'm gonna go down, scroll down. Okay, so we're gonna do client.update item. Okay, you're gonna give it a table name. It's gonna be students. And now the key. So you have to define the key that you're updating, right? So our case, it's student ID. We wanna update the row with student ID 2. Okay, so that means the row over here. That's gonna be our key, and now it's gonna take in a new parameter called attribute updates. Okay, and now let's say we wanna update the name. So from Alice, we wanna put it to Bob or something. Okay, so the way you do it is you give it the attribute, so name, and then you pass it a dictionary where you give it a value. Okay, and the value is gonna be the actual value called string, which is, let's say, Bob. Okay, and the next thing, you have to pass it a value, and then you have to pass it something called a method or an action. It's called an action, and in this case it's gonna be put, because we are just updating the data. The reason you have to define an action is when you're updating existing attribute, you can also do things like if the attribute is a list, you can like append to the list or do stuff like that. In our case, we're just inserting a new data, like just literally substituting Bob for Alice. So we have put over here. I'm gonna link the documentation in the description. There are different actions you can use depending on the data type of the attribute that you're trying to update. There are pretty cool things you can do, but we're gonna keep it very simple. So I'm gonna just use the put action. All right, so that's all we need. I'm gonna run it. So just keep an eye on student ID 2, name Alice. So it ran, I'm gonna refresh. And you see student ID 2 became Bob. So pretty straightforward, we can just update it easily. We can try doing it for gender, because you see the gender is not defined over here for Bob. So we're gonna do gender, and let's say the value is gonna be a string, which is gonna be a male, so M. Let's see what happens. So just keep an eye, student ID 2 does not have a gender defined, and now student ID 2 has a gender defined as M. Okay, we can do like once more. Let's give it a name. Let's give it a string, which is gonna be, let's do, I don't know, let's do like Mary. Yeah, I'm going with the most generic names. And let's run it. Here you go, we're gonna refresh, change to Mary. And then if you wanna change the gender, so you can like, of course, do multiple attributes at a time. I'm just doing one at a time. And then let's change it to F, which is gonna be for female. Run it. Pretty sure it ran. And you see this updated. So pretty straightforward. You can easily get data, insert data, delete data, and update data. Very, very simple to use. And given it's a NoSQL database and you can add as many columns as you want, it becomes very flexible when you're starting out with an app and then evolving it over time. So I would strongly recommend trying out NoSQL databases like these if you don't know the schema ahead of time. When it comes to NoSQL databases, you could use MongoDB, and then this one is DynamoDB. Personally, I find DynamoDB more easy to work with. MongoDB requires some more work and also some more knowledge about how to query data and how to write data. Whereas as you saw in DynamoDB, if you want to do the basic operations, it's pretty straightforward, which is always nice. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below. I am gonna have another video where I talk about DynamoDB in details, things like what's a primary key, what's a partition key, sort key, the different ways you can query the database, because even though it looks pretty simple, when it comes to reading data, there are things you want to keep in mind. So I'm gonna have a video going in depth about all those things. But hopefully this was a good starting point for you to start using DynamoDB. And once your application starts evolving, hopefully I'll have another video out that's gonna help you kind of evolve your code with it. So with that being said, hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And I hope you guys have a good rest of the day. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.